This week on Life and Faith.
We tend to think about the United States as a Christian country, but it actually isn't. It wasn't designed to be. It was designed to be an open country where anyone could come and they would have freedom of conscience to believe what they wanted. We all share the same public space.
When you trust that another person is doing their best, you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt.
None of us can guarantee staying somewhere forever.
Cognitive ability became what I call the gold standard of human esteem.
If I try being normal, what is it like?
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. This year is an extraordinary year for the number of elections going on around the world. India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the UK, there's one in North Macedonia, in case you missed that one, and also the United States. This one is such a significant world event, we have decided to do 2 episodes of Life and Faith on it. We are thinking especially of the role that faith, for better or worse, and probably worse, will play in that election. Last time on the program, we had Michael Ware, former advisor for faith initiatives in the Obama White House and now founder and CEO of the Center for Christianity and Public Life. This week, we head south to talk to a New Testament scholar from Dallas Theological Seminary, Darrell Bock. Darrell is also the Executive Director for Cultural Engagement at the Hendricks Center. He is therefore very interested in the cultural currents that he swims in. Darrell is an old friend of CPX. He's been on the show a number of times. He was in town for several engagements, speaking at the CPX fundraising lunch, just one of them, and also checking in on the progress of the Sydney Swans AFL team, who he is known to watch in the early hours of the morning in Dallas. In that sense, he chose a good year to come. The Swans are doing very well. But getting back to the point, the polarisation of our politics is so evident at the moment and in this year of elections. I was keen to understand the way in which Darrell was experiencing that in the US. Darrell Bock, welcome back to Australia. It's great to have you at Life and Faith.
Oh, it's good to be back. I really miss Sydney when I'm not here, and it's good to be back.
I want to jump into a bunch of topics. I don't think they'll be surprising to you, Darrell, but I recently saw the film Civil War that depicts not the war of the 19th century in the US, but of a future war between the federal government and secessionist movements and states, and it's really frightening. It's stark and brutal, and it feels possible. Do you ever fear that the polarisation in the States could, in fact, end up in a place like that?
I think the answer is January 6th. January 6th showed that it was possible, and to the extent that we have people who are fomenting deep division, really on each side of the political ideology spectrum, it does become a possibility because we cease to treat one another as fellow citizens of a country, and we tend to see them in parties and tribes and that kind of thing, and at war with one another in an ideological sense. So, yes, I think it's possible. I think there are a lot of things that work against it, but it is possible should things break down. I think if you had asked me 10 years ago if the United States would be where it is now, I would go, no, not likely. And that would have been dead wrong.
Yeah, it's happened very quickly. With this kind of flavour of polarisation, contempt is a word that people often use now. It's a pretty hard place to get from, isn't it? Contempt to a place where you can actually engage with difference in a productive way.
Yeah, and I think that most people underestimate how the United States Constitution was designed to deal with difference. It was designed from the very beginning to deal with difference. The whole, we emphasize religious liberty in the United States, and that gives protection to religion, but it also gives protection to the agnostic and the atheist.
Yeah.
And most people think through that. In fact, I was writing a piece yesterday for an organization I'm a part of in the States. It's called Christians in Public Service. It ministers to government civil servants. And the point that I was making was that we tend to think about the United States as a Christian country, but it actually isn't. It wasn't designed to be. It was designed to be an open country where anyone could come and they would have freedom of conscience to believe what they wanted. But the flip side of that is that and I say this as a way of proving that we're not a Christian country, is everyone has the same rights, whether they're agnostic, an atheist, a Muslim, a Unitarian, a Presbyterian, a Baptist, a Pentecostal. I mean, you take your pick. They all have the same rights in the law. We all share the same public space. So the question becomes, how are we going to share that public space with difference? Now, I don't know if Australia is set up in a similar kind of way or not. France is set up in somewhat of a similar way, but with a difference that's pretty important, and that is religion has been ruled out of the public square in France in terms of the way they conduct their public business, whereas religion is very much in the public square in the United States. So those kinds of differences can make a difference in how discourse takes place.
Yes, and there's so many things coming out of that. I mean, Australia's a bit different, of course, because we, came here as a colony.
The law-abiding Australian.
yes, a convict colony, and so we didn't have the same nature of the breakaway that you had. And so, a lot of what the US was trying to get away from what had happened in Europe.
Exactly
it was
right.
Sort of, we're going to do this differently in this new land.
Yeah, there wouldn't be a state church. We aren't going to impose our religion on you and the structure of our society. We're going to leave it open, and that means open in every direction conceivable. Of course, what's happened in our lifetime as people have moved and as the flow of people between nations has shifted is the amount of diversity that you were dealing with in the United States, say, 100 years ago, is not anywhere near the level of diversity that you're dealing with now. And that has added, not only are there differences, but there are multiple differences between people, which adds to your body politic if you don't have something that holds you together.
It must be at least 10 years ago now that Robert Putnam wrote his book American Grace, which was looking at the structure of American religiosity and the way that works and how all these incredible differences somehow seem to hold together. I'd be interested to see what he'd say now. I think that the whole theory was that this incredible mix of different people and different cultures worked because they cross-pollinate. People marry outside of their race, outside of their religion, and that, in a sense, forms this social glue that holds people together. That miracle might be starting to fade a bit.
Yeah, and in fact, there's another book, the title of which I can't remember off the top of my head, but it deals with the history of the Supreme Court with regard to religious liberty. And the point that it's making is that there has been a shift in the way the courts have handled religious liberty conversations in the public square in the last 25 to 50 years, and that has broken down a kind of détente or peace agreement that existed between the various factions in trying to work together and thinking about the role of compromise and common good and those kinds of concepts. If you ask me what the problem is, there are several, but one of the problems we have way too much money and way too much special interest in our politics. And so politicians cease to be committed and accountable to their constituents. They are committed and accountable to the people who give them money so that they can run for re-election. And that becomes a major problem for us. And legally, that structure has been defended, even though there were efforts to try and control it. It's been defended by the courts, and so as a result, money flows pretty freely in our elections, and so the one with the most toys wins.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to flow in good directions. Now, much of the tension in the US seems to emerge from a feeling among large swathes of the population that the American dream is not something they can believe in anymore. Now, what's the shape of that loss of faith?
That's actually a good question. I do think it's true that a lot of people feel locked in and unable to advance, if I can say it that way. You used to hear, and they still exist, the stories of people who start off from a very limited background who get there, but it's harder in many ways.
And you hear about the ones that make it.
Exactly.
There's an awful lot of
people. There are people who try and don't get, they're trying to leap over the wall and they hit the wall. They don't get over the wall. So I think what we have lost in the United States is this sense of national unity about who we are as a people. And you have different people striving for different perceptions of what we ought to be. And then here's the trick. They want to impose that on people who do not share their view. And so that's the challenge, is everybody's fighting for privilege, if I can say it that way. And they don't have the sense of caring for the minority, which our original structure was designed to care for. And when you lose that element, you lose that sense of, our motto is out of many one. When you lose that ability to care for your neighbor who's different than you lose that ability to build towards that unity of purpose, and that ends up being damaging. And the hard thing is a civil servant, someone who works in the government, is elected to serve all the people, not their political party.
Yeah.
And not their ideology.
Because, of course, there is unity in the US, but it's unity amongst your particular tribe.
Correct.
And that might feel good, especially when you feel under pressure. But the overall picture is troubling.
And especially when there are many tribes and many nations in the country, because it's not one or two groups. It's 6 or 7 or 8 or 20 or 25. And so the more fragmented that becomes. And the hard part of the United States right now is that the country is pretty evenly divided between what gets characterized as the left and the right, with a very small middle. And that middle group, which is now shrunk down probably to about 15 to 20% of our population, that middle group decides our big elections, but has no representation in Congress.
Right.
And they swing back and forth between the two sides. And every election, really since the year 2000, has been fairly close because of the nature of the way our populace is divided right now.
Now, I want to ask you about religion in the US, and sort of stepping back for a moment. It's a bewildering landscape of not just different faiths, but, for instance, within Christianity, different denominations, and sort of incredible range of these. Now, the history of the US is fascinating in the way it creates that landscape, isn't it?
You know, freedom of religion, which means I tease people.
Believe anything.
Yeah, I live in the buckle of the Bible Belt in the South in Dallas. And I tease people, you can find your Christianity any way you want. You can get it with tacos. You can get it with barbecue. You can get it with pasta. You can get it with a croissant. You can get Christianity in any form you want. And you can find a church that does that. That's so different than the experience I had when we were in Aberdeen doing my doctoral work, in
Scotland.
There were so few Christians of the total population. You were forced really to function together if you're going to seek to represent Christ in the context in which you find yourself. And I'm suspicious that the same kind of thing sort of exists here, where your percentages are small. In Dallas, 50% of the population is in a house of worship on any given weekend.
See, that's incomprehensible to someone from this country, where the figure would be more like 8%.
Yes. And it's even worse in Britain.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's even worse in Britain.
Or worse if you're a Christian. Some people might think that's a good thing.
Yeah. But anyway, the whole point here is that you have this variety, and therefore Christians can spend time sniping at one another.
Yeah.
There are enough of us in each of those groups to create that reality. Whereas in many countries where Christians are such a significant minority, you've got to figure out a different way to do it. You might snipe, but you aren't going to snipe in the same way.
You'll be looking for a unity of what's core to the belief.
That's right.
And gather around that.
Exactly.
To sort of support each other, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, now I have to ask you about the politicization of faith in America. This does not seem to have been a good trend in my mind. So it's much commented on that one side of politics has captured, especially the evangelical vote, but not just the vote. We now have a situation where evangelical is a political label. Now, why is that problematic?
Well, that's problematic because it actually is a denial of the way our government and public space has been structured. Everyone has the same rights and the same privileges. If I try and impose my way of living on people who don't want to live that way, that produces a problem. Yeah. And I tell people the gospel exists because it makes sense. You invite people into a changed way of life with a changed heart. And that's part of what the gospel is about, is to be a contrastive entity. You also do away with any rationale for the church. I say if the church is just an extension of a political arm, it becomes a special interest group. Yeah. If it becomes a special interest group, it's like any special interest group, and there are lots to choose from. So it loses its distinctiveness of what it offers the world, and that's another problem. So we have in the United States now what I call political evangelicalism, and then we have what I call theological evangelicalism. And that difference has frayed the evangelical movement to a certain degree. And the hard part of this is that there are people who are concerned about where the culture is drifting to, and they're reacting out of a combination of frustration and fear.
Yeah.
And that's produced the intensity that you see coming from many. And they think the only way they can do it is to fight like the world. And so that's what they've done. And the problem is, in doing that, you've undercut your distinctiveness. The distinctiveness of Christianity, at least in its claims from Jesus, is you're supposed to love all people, and you're supposed to love especially your enemy. That's what makes it distinctive. And sometimes I look at the way in which Christians talk about other people who are outside the faith, and I go, I'm not sure I hear too many notes of love in the way in which we talk about other people.
You're listening to Life and Faith, and I'm speaking with Darrell Bock, Professor of New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary and dissector of culture, and especially how American evangelicalism interacts with the culture. From here, we start to talk about that and where things might have gone off track. How did all this happen? Because it sort of starts, I think I'm right in saying, in the sort of early 1980s. This capturing of the right, the political right, capturing the sort of Christian vote. Prior to this, Christians were associated with kind of progressive causes like trade union movements and freeing slaves and these sorts of things. That's right, isn't it? And we get into the 1980s period where things start to shift.
Well, I think what's happening is that the church was coping with the fact that it had lost its central place in the culture. I'd like to say in my lifetime, we went from being the home team to being the visiting team, and not just the visiting team, but the visiting team are the rivals who get booed. And so that's a huge shift. And so that made people who are used to being in the center of the culture uncomfortable. And they've worked hard to try and re-seize control and fight for, in some ways, the heart of America. But the problem has been the way they fought for the heart actually has, I think, done damage to everybody, both to the church and to the society at large, because in doing so, they haven't done it in a way that is reflective of the commitment of the gospel. I tell people, God doesn't impose himself on people. He lets them make bad choices. Now, they're responsible for those bad choices, and they're accountable to him for those bad choices, but he doesn't impose himself on people in the way that government ideology can attempt to do. And so how do you work for a kind of common good in the public square where you're recognizing everybody has the same rights and privileges, and you're trying to do it in a way that allows for, in some cases, compromise? And the place where you live distinctively is in your community, in your church community. We've tried to do away with that, and that has been dangerous. I also say that if you look at the Hebrew Scripture, the Old Testament, and you look at the experiment of having God's people present with God's law but without changed hearts, that experiment was largely a failure, and that led to the New Covenant, which is the only way we're going to fix this is if we do something from the inside out, if people's hearts are changed. And so all the examples that we have around us tell us this can't work to try and impose your privilege and presence on people, and it's actually problematic to try and do so.
There's two things that really stand out to me as you're talking. One was the belief that God kind of offers enough respect to individuals to allow them to make choices, even if they're not ones he would want them to make. And the way that doesn't really work in a kind of politicized environment. But also that the love of enemy, the idea that you're challenged at least to perceive your enemy in a particular way where you're meant to serve them, and a radical message, isn't it? But we're not seeing a lot of that.
No, we're not. And unfortunately, it is an immense problem because what you're trying to communicate is something that every believer experiences if they understand the theology behind the church. The theology behind the church is that all of us had our backs turned to God at one point or another. And God taps us at the shoulder as he takes the initiative to reach out to those whose backs are turned to God. And we forget that the person who challenges the church is in the very position we were in at one time. We forget where we came from. And that's the grace of God. If you lose that sense of the grace of God as you're interacting with people who are different than you, you will undercut the grace of God that is a part of the Christian story. And unfortunately, it gets lost. I'm in the midst of a huge project with the World Evangelical Alliance in which we're talking about the definition of evangelicalism and the way in which evangelicalism is perceived in the world. And the thing that we are moving towards as we talk about this is, how can evangelicals be positive in the world and show that they care for the world in a way in which they interact? Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have your convictions, you don't stand up for what you believe, but you learn how to advocate for what you believe in, put it in the democratic public space, and if you lose,
You lose.
you lose, and you lose well.
Yeah.
And we have forgotten how to lose well.
Interested in this distinction between theological evangelicalism and political evangelicalism. Isn't it the case that there's a lot of people who say, oh, yeah, I'm an evangelical, but really they mean something very different from what a classical evangelical would have believed, and often don't have a lot of, on the measurements of things like attendance to church or Bible reading, those sorts of things, don't score very highly on those at all.
Yeah, the very interesting thing about the polling about evangelicalism in the United States is people will self-adopt the label, but they won't actually reflect the practice of what evangelicalism has at its core. So there's a substantial amount of people who call themselves Christian or might even identify as evangelical who don't go to church on a regular basis. They aren't involved in the community. They aren't closely engaged. And actually, in many of the statistics, the more engaged someone is with the church, the more concerned they are about what's happening in the United States. Yep. And so that's an interesting issue. The challenge is that we have some very prominent, very visible leaders who are as evangelical theologically as you can imagine. I mean, they own all the prime characteristics of a theological evangelical, but they are prominent in defending what I've described as political evangelicalism, and they fuse the two together. Yeah. And that also produces a problem because that legitimizes the person who says, this is the way I ought to conduct my Christian faith.
Yeah, that is a bit depressing, Darrell. Now, what should be the experience of politicians and political parties when they encounter the church?
I think that the church should be a place where we encourage the best of people relationally in the midst of differences and the best of what we can do to serve people, including people who are marginalized. The Bible has a lot to say about caring for people on the margins. The Gospel of Luke, where I've spent my life, is literally loaded with passages that do this. So there is that element. One can discuss and debate how that should be done, but that kind of compassion and empathy for people is something that a politician should try to seek from the church, and the church should be providing that. Yeah. And of course, that's part of what the church is struggling to provide in some cases, because the church sees itself in a culture war, much of the church does, which means that people who I disagree with are very much the enemy. And of course, biblically speaking, you couldn't have that more wrong. People are not the enemy. Even people who push back against God are not the enemy. They're actually the goal. The Great Commission says, go out into the world and make disciples. It doesn't say go into the church and make disciples. And so the assumption is I'm engaging with people who currently aren't that close to God about considering being close to God, and that relationship is worth it. It's life-changing.
And there's a way to do that and a way not to do that, presumably.
Correct.
Donald Trump has been found guilty of falsifying business records. He has other charges coming up in various jurisdictions. Will this damage or help his political cause?
I think the answer to that question, only God knows.
What do you think?
There are two strands pulling in two ways, and we're seeing it. On the one hand, it is, how can I say this, enabling and energizing his own base because they feel the injustice. That what they see is an injustice. They feel it's unjust what's happened to him.
Like it's a politicized
judiciary system.
Yeah.
Exactly, et cetera. And so that has energized people on his behalf who think that he has been done bad by. On the other hand, a lot of people struggle with the idea of, I'm going to vote for someone as president who is a felon and who has complained about the way our structure works. I mean, it's almost an inherent contradiction that the president puts his hand on a Bible and no, we're not a Christian country. He puts his hand on a Bible and swears to uphold the Constitution and the structure that we have. And here we have someone complaining about the way in which that structure is playing itself out. That creates my bald hairline to think about that idea. And so it's a conundrum, kind of what we're facing, because, Trump said he could murder someone on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. And he's, in some senses, figuratively pulled the trigger. And we're seeing whether or not he can get away with it or not.
It's a very interesting period we're entering this year, Darrell. You don't want to stay here in Australia for a bit longer, maybe?
Why do you think I'm here this summer? No, I mean, it's a challenge. It's a challenge the church should be up for. And part of what we try and do is to try and keep people focused on what makes the faith worth living in a context like this. If it can't work in a context like this, then why do you have a faith that says that having a commitment to God makes a difference in life?
The secularization of the US, a bit behind Australia, but it's picking up pace, and especially among young people.
Mm-hmm.
I think from what I've heard and read, a not unimportant part of that has been the politicization of
Correct.
faith. A lot of the younger people are just very disillusioned with that. That's
Correct.
right. Yeah.
Well, in fact, it's even more devastating to think about it this way, which is the very things that Christians were railing against in their political leaders at the turn into this century are the very things some of its leaders are now defending, simply because the politician in view is on the other side of the divide.
Yeah.
That's very inconsistent and very transparent. And so you sit there and you say, well, you say this matters and that character matters and that these kinds of things matter, but now I'm seeing a situation in which you're excusing all kinds of things that 15 years ago you were saying were essential to rail against.
Yeah.
And so that inconsistency, I think, has driven a lot of people away, young people. And the hard part of it is they're right to see it. And so, what do? The Christian faith talks about repentance and turning and changing direction and that kind of thing. The church is in need of, a substantial portion of the church is in need of repenting. There are lots of people who could do a better job of defending some of the things people legitimately care about than the leader that many have chosen. Having said that, I also say this, that Donald Trump is not the problem. He is a symptom of a deeper problem.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Tell us, what is that deeper problem?
Well, the deeper problem is that people have lost the sense of sacrifice and service to people different than them that's at the heart of Christianity. And they want to protect their own rights and their own privileges. They don't want to be generous to people who come with differences, who have needs, that kind of thing. And so there's a lack of what I would call deep discipleship in the church that has produced the situation we find ourselves in. They are more afraid of what is going on, whether it be secularization, Marxism, communism, you can put anything in that bad list. They are more fearful. And I think there's a passage that they fail to apply. And the passage they fail to apply goes, greater is he that is in you than he who's in the world. And I say the church doesn't believe that anymore, and they need to believe that, because your security is not found in what's going on around you. Your security is found in your relationship to God.
And so once the believer loses that, what does the world that's not part of that community, what do they miss out on?
Well, everybody misses out, whether they're in the faith or not in the faith. Everyone misses out on a call that God created us to have to one another. I tell people, if you want to understand Christianity, you better understand Genesis 1. Now, we've turned Genesis 1 to a huge debate about Adam and Eve. But Genesis 1 is about something actually pretty fundamental, and that is, why did God make us the way that he did? Now, for some people, that sentence doesn't even make sense. But the idea is we're made in God's image. We're made to reflect the character and the person of God and the ability of the Trinity itself to interact with each other and be harmonious in the way they conduct themselves. And he created man and woman on the earth to multiply and subdue the earth. I say it's a stewardship passage. And this stewardship passage is designed to say to us, we're supposed to make creation hum. We're all supposed to be hummers, okay? And we're to make creation hum. It's supposed to be functional. It's supposed to work. We're supposed to cooperate and collaborate with one another, in which we don't see the world as a scarcity place in our zero-sum game, in which the only way I win is if you lose.
Yeah.
But no, that God has created a creation that gives abundance, and when we work together, we can experience that abundance together, we can share that abundance together, and we can collaborate together in a way that works. We have forsaken collaboration with one another for competition with one another. And that means that what the Christian faith is designed to offer, and Genesis 1 offers it as the starting point, is the idea of giving us location in life and making sense out of why we're here.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. Thank you to Darrell Bock for giving us some time in the studio while he was here in Sydney and helping us to understand the political landscape he is from a little better. If you've enjoyed this episode or last week's, which was broadly on the same topic, please send it to someone you know who would appreciate it too. We love to get more people into the life and faith conversation. Thank you again this week to our producer, the ever collaborative and forgiving Alan Douthwaite. Next week.
I guess I never really stopped being interested in children's literature. I think that would probably be the most accurate way of phrasing it. I was a kind of classic bookworm when I was a kid, and then just never really stopped reading children's books. They're not only fun and quirky, but also dealing with some complex issues.